Gouache.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's class, Gouache 101, Blending and Layering Basics, I believe is that full title. Uh, I'm your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and tonight's class, we're going to be covering painting with gouache. If you are unfamiliar with gouache, it is opaque watercolor, and it's a lot of fun, and we've had quite a few gouache classes over the years since I've been teaching these classes for Michael's, and Rich has a lovely playlist that he can share with you on YouTube if you want to search for some other gouache classes that I have taught. I titled this one Gouache 101 so that you could easily find the other Gouache 101 class that I did, that this one would lead nicely into from that class to this class, even though that one was over a year ago. And in that class, I went over just some basic brushstroke techniques and talked about the viscosity of gouache and how we could create a monochromatic value scale, which we will be doing tonight before we get started painting this little nature item together. And tonight's class is my last class of March 2025 here. We've got a week break, and then I'll be back in April to do some classes on drawing drapery, and then another fun gouache class that will be continued into May. So I'm excited about those. And I'll go ahead and switch to my tabletop view and go over supplies, and we'll get started. Okay, so don't forget to tag your work with those hashtags, Make It With Michael's or Michael's Classes, and wherever you share your work online. And you can find me online by visiting my link tree. It's just linktree/Adrienne Hodge. And here's some of my artwork on my business cards from several years back on using calligraphy ink on paper. And I've got art prints available. I've got some other online classes that I teach independently. And then if you're in the Austin area, I've got a number of independent classes that I teach in person at my studio and at the Contemporary Austin Art School at Laguna Gloria. Okay, so I did my little practice demo in a watercolor sketchbook. So you might notice that the paper that I used here for the example is different than the paper that we're going to be using for the class. So we're going to do this exact same thing, but we're going to be using this Artist Loft watercolor pad 9x12, but we're still going to make a little box, and we're still going to do our little value scale over here to the side. I also have a Artist Loft sketchbook or drawing pad. I already had it flipped to an open page, but here we go, that 9x12 drawing pad. So we can do some sketching beforehand and just talk about drawing this little nature item here. And then I have a set of Artist Loft watercolor paint brushes. We've got some not watercolor, Artist Loft sketching pencils and Artist Loft kneaded eraser. Got one that's already open. Let's see, we've got our paper towels, our tape. My tape is holding my little pencil sharpener over here. Got some Artist Loft tape, and then this Artist Loft jelly gouache set. And I actually just picked up a new Artist Loft jelly gouache set that has 24 colors. I'll also have that one, but I'll stick to this one since that's the one that I put on the supply list. And I think that's it. There's a lot of supplies on my desk right now. That's it. And then we've got the reference photo that I provided in a PDF. So if you're watching later on YouTube and you just click underneath the video where it shows the show notes and it says more ... click on that and you can download the PDF with our reference images and water cups. I like to have 2 water cups so that we don't have to refill our water too much. Okay, that is it. Any questions about supplies before I move on? I don't think so. Okay. Let me get some of these unsightly things out of the way. So we're going to pull out our sketch paper first and do some preliminary sketching of this item. And you are welcome to use a different item. In fact, I always love it when people in these classes take what I'm teaching and apply it to their own thing. I try to pride myself as a teacher on giving you tools that can be translated to anything. And full disclosure, I use this lesson in my in-person painting class that I teach. I teach gouache painting at Laguna Gloria, and this is the first project that I will do with a new group of students. I actually just started that class last week, so maybe some of my very small in-person class students will, I told them about this class tonight, don't know if they're here, but told them this was happening, and so this is the assignment that we ended our class just starting last week. Anyway, we usually have them walk around and do a little nature walk because it's such beautiful grounds there at Laguna Gloria, and have them pick up a little leaf or something like this, a little piece of wood that fell off of a tree branch or a twig or whatever, just some little small nature item, an acorn, maybe a feather, because we have peacocks roaming around at Laguna Gloria. And then we just study the value scale of that image using one color. So for this one, I chose blue, and I'm going to be using blue tonight to do it all again. It'll be very similar to this when I'm done. But if you want to do the full value scale of green, that would be awesome. If you want to do yellow, and I'll talk about yellow's a little different because we wouldn't necessarily use black with yellow. You can, but when you do, that's going to turn a little greenish when you add black to it. So you might use brown as your darkest value on a yellow value scale. So if you want to choose your own adventure here and grab a leaf or maybe a flower or a feather, if you've got one handy, something like that, if you want to do your own thing. Or if not, then you can just provided these reference images and we can do the same thing. But if you would like to use a different color, that would also make it a little unique when we're done here. Okay, so let's sketch it first together. I'm going to sketch it nice and big in my sketchbook first with a really dark pencil so everybody can see my lines. And then I'll sketch it again real light and loose on the watercolor paper, and then we'll get started painting. And we maybe will not get fully, we maybe will not fully develop this by the end of the hour and a half. I think we will though, because we're gonna use some tricks here, and it's a very small study here. And I like to call everything that I do pretty much all the time a study or an exercise. That way I don't put pressure on myself for it to be a fully finished work of art. Finished is such a relative term anyway. Okay, so first of all, we're going to be drawing a rectangular image. So I'm just going to sketch out a little rectangular frame here for this exercise, and I'll be turning my paper this direction, landscape. So we'll just, for preliminary sketching, or if you're ready to go, you want to go ahead and start sketching this on the watercolor paper, just make sure you sketch nice and light. And we are going to tape down our frame on the watercolor paper. So maybe don't jump ahead just yet. I've got a trick for taping down without needing a ruler. Those of you who come to these classes all the time probably already know it. Okay, next we're going to look at this image and we're going to identify some key characteristics of this little piece of wood here. I think what jumps out at me is this big circular shape right here, and this circular shape, and this circular shape, and then the overall way that the bark of this little tree branch piece follows around those little knobby moments. And so it curves like little waves around that. So let's start with those big circles. Well, overall, we'll start with the whole shape of this piece of wood. And I'm going to use the negative space. I'm just trying to keep it like that, but it keeps wanting to rotate. Well, I'm going to look at the negative space that I'm seeing in this frame, this rectangular frame, to get that overall outer shape. And this is a very organic thing. And if you're using a leaf or something else, keep in mind that it's organic. And so that means it doesn't have any specific shape that it needs to be perfectly exact. And I'm using a 6B pencil right now so that my lines will show up easily on the screen. You should use whatever pencil you feel the most comfortable with, or maybe an H pencil so that you can easily erase your lines. Sorry, give me just one moment. I'm having a little runny nose moment. There's no glamorous way to pretend I didn't need to pause for a tissue. Okay, so we've got that outer shape, pretty generic, maybe like a boat shape that goes off the edge of our frame there. And again, does not need to be perfect, but there's one little sticky outy moment right here. You want those uneven knobby moments to stick out. So let's go ahead and recognize a couple of those. And if you're working with your own item, same thing. Recognize where there are some unusual moments sticking out, because that's what gives it character and what makes it feel like the thing that we're drawing, which is an organic item from nature. And so it's not going to be perfect. So if you draw it too perfect, then it doesn't feel real. And maybe even we can't figure out what it is if it's a little too perfect like that. And we're going to go very general to specific. So I'm going to start with some big circles here for those circular moments that I pointed out. So now we've got something that feels like a wonky kazoo. Okay, so we're just looking at those basic shapes and then we're going to make them more specific as we go. So first we've got that circle. That circle's a little too perfect now. So I'm going to ignore it if you're drawing nice and light. I'm going to erase it a little bit because I drew darker. Oh, thank you, Jennifer. I saw a kazoo. I'm always looking for another shape that something looks like other than what it is, because for some reason I've recognized that our brains tell us that it's hard to draw the thing that we're drawing. There's that critical voice in our heads. It's so mean. It's like, you can't draw that piece of wood. Like, okay, well, can I draw a kazoo? Sure, why not? That seems low risk. Okay, and then I'm just looking at these smaller circles that I'm seeing, and I'm keeping my image off the Zoom screen because it will make it hard for you to see my graphite. It messes with my light too much. So I'm just, again, looking for those more general shapes. And then I'm starting to notice this little curve that the tree bark is doing around that larger shape, and that there are some smaller circles inside of there. They're not perfect circles again, so maybe draw them a little imperfectly or leave them open. Some of them even kind of feel like little spirals that spiral into each other. And then there are some very significant cracks that stick out. So we'll start to look for some of those, just some more prominent shapes that we're seeing. And so far I'm drawing them as one line, but we want to start to make them into shapes. So notice the three-dimensional aspect of those shapes and lines. because what we're really looking for here is some different shapes of value. So looking at this black and white image, as we start to get into the monochromatic color, we're going to be designating certain levels of value to each one of these shapes. So we're looking for shapes. So in these really dark black shadows, I'm seeing some wavy little crescent moon shapes that get stretched out and hug each other. And then we've got this knobby moment that was one of the circles we talked about. We can start to look for some more specific shapes that we're seeing there, but don't be too perfect about it. You just want it to be somewhere in the neighborhood of the shape that you're seeing, and you want it to follow these curves around these other shapes that we noticed, the circle and the little wavy crescent moon shapes that the cracks create. And we could talk about the contour lines here, which is something I always tend to default to, describing contour lines with a form like this, but I'm trying a new thing when I teach these classes where I just focus on the necessary information for us to get the job done. Not that I want us to be more product-based, but I don't want to overwhelm us too much. And sometimes when we talk about all those different terms, plus a lot of you already know it, and for the beginners, it can really help us jump to the point where we're doing the thing without overthinking it too much. I'm just looking for some of these prominent shapes, and it's really starting to feel like a piece of driftwood or a piece of wood with all these interesting cracks without even going too much into the contours. But if we did want to go into the contours, we would recognize that there's an elevation shift that's happening here. It's higher up right here, so that's why it bulges out a little bit more. And then in the recesses, there's going to be darker values because it's a recess, but we could maybe recognize that there is sort of a dome-like curve happening here. And that would help us when we're adding our color and our paint, because then we would want to try to make our paint brush strokes follow these curves. But I think we're just going to do that anyway, just by default of trying to fill in these shapes. So we don't necessarily need to know about the contours every time, and the light is telling us everything we need to know. So if we just focus on these shapes of shadows and shapes of light, they're going to describe the contours because the light is falling across those contours. We've had plenty of classes on understanding contour lines and three-dimensional forms that you can check out on that playlist or by searching on YouTube my name and contour lines. Okay, I think that's enough. That's really starting to give us a lot to work with here. And just to point out some of the different values, first let's just sketch a little value scale here and talk about that real briefly, just review it. Okay, so we drawn a long skinny rectangle, and I'm writing value scale. So we've got 0 and 10. 0 is our blank paper if we're just drawing, or our absolute white because we're painting with gouache today. So we've got absolute white. And then on the other end of the value scale, we've got our absolute black. So when I say our 0s and our 10s, I'm talking about our absolute whites and our absolute blacks. And I'm going to take the side of my heavy B pencil here. Let me find an even heavier one. I've got a 6B. Use, looking for an 8B. Yeah, here's a 12B. That'll work. but I really wanted an 8B. Okay, because you guys might not have a 12B. So 8B, and I'm gonna use little tonal shading. So I want to get it to an absolute black, no paper peeking through. And then I'll let up on my pressure. Not looking for a perfect value scale here, just refreshing our knowledge of value. And we're looking for a mid-tone, so somewhere in between. And then we want to blend that out a little bit. And then we can switch to a lighter B pencil for the, or maybe an HB for the mid-tone values. And then start to let up on that pressure. And then when we get over here to the end by our 0, we want to use an H pencil. So I've got an H, maybe a 2H or a 4H. And you're looking for just a baby's breath of value for the 1. And then becoming more of a mid-tone. Again, just blending it out. Okay, so that's our full value scale. So as we're looking at this black and white image, and I included black and white, and then the full color image if anybody wanted to add some other colors to it and paint it true to color and not do monochromatic, you've got that option. And then I made it black and white or silver tone. And then in one of the pictures, I turned up the contrast. So all of the dark values appeared even darker and even more obvious. So we want to assign our different values to these different shapes. And we're looking for our 10 values. Those are our absolute black shapes first. And we see some very dark black shapes throughout, right? Some of these shadows are going super dark. So if you wanted to go ahead and fill those in with your pencil just to practice, you can. And then we're noticing all of the mid-tones. Where is it more of a medium gray? Like right here, there's this whole area that's really more of a medium tone. And then we've obviously got a lot of white highlights. And again, we're not looking for perfection here. We're just trying to get it to look somewhat like this thing. So if we recognized even just 4 or 5 values, and one thing that we might do here that I actually did do with this example, I did not go all the way to black, because sometimes going all the way to black can, especially with natural items like this, slate black is not a color that does often occur in nature, even though in our photograph, because I turned up the contrast, it is in there. But I didn't quite completely finish this study either, so I could go a little darker. So I do have black in my value scale here, but my darkest values are really more of like an 8 or a 9 on the value scale. And I feel like staying in that range at first, maybe you just stay there. Maybe you don't go all the way to black in your shadows, or maybe you just use the color and white. So you have more of a limited palette. So it's just going to like a medium blue and then your tints of your blue. So it's up to you if you want to keep it more on that light scale or how dark you want to go. But we'll move on to making that value scale in our gouache now. If there are no questions about sketching or drawing or looking for these values, we'll keep coming back to this topic as we go. So I'm going to move my sketchbook out of the way and get set up to paint here. I've definitely been known to take a class like this and make it more of a 2-part class and take a full class to talk about drawing the thing, but I tried to keep this one so simple because it's just a simple item. And you could even use a different item, so we don't need to worry too much about perfection on the drawing aspect here. Okay, so we're gonna take our watercolor paper and our tape, and we're gonna start to tape down this frame. So we're not gonna even need our pencils to draw our frame unless you just really want to use your pencil. And if you have a ruler and you'd rather measure it all out, then you are welcome to do that. But I have a little trick that really helps me not need a ruler. And that is to take my tape and get it nice and straight. Definitely doesn't hurt that I have this mat board underneath my sketchbook where I can compare that straight line to my blue tape. And I'm just gonna make a little bit of a margin. We can pull this tape up if it's not where we want it to be the first time. Starting to think about creating a rectangle on this page, a landscape rectangle. And our margins don't even need to be perfect with this. So it's okay if it's not perfect, but I'm just eyeballing it and getting it nice and straight at the top and the bottom. And then I'm just wrapping my tape around my little block here. Okay. And then we're going to use the margins to create our little value scale in just a moment. So that's another reason to have the margins, and taping it off will give it this nice clean line on the edges. When we peel the tape off, it'll really just elevate it to have it framed like this. Okay, so I'm looking for a rectangle. Just gonna go ahead and put this one down and then see if I need to adjust it. It is kind of a long, skinny rectangle, isn't it? So let me get it a little longer here. Just realized I painted it kind of pointing a different direction in my other one. Also, even more full disclosure, I was painting a different piece of wood in my example. My example was from a piece of wood that I never photographed. And then I just happened to find a photograph on my phone of a piece of wood that looked similar. And I was like, perfect, we'll use that. In case anybody noticed that these are not the exact same, not the exact same piece of wood that we're painting as in my example, but it is close enough. Okay, so we got that all taped off, and you just want to make sure that it looks straight and looks fairly even. Don't be afraid to peel the tape off and try again if it doesn't. And now I'm just moving some stuff around my desk to make some room for all my painting supplies here. Water cups, candy. And give y'all some time to finish taping those down. Okay, and then, oh, I just realized when I was talking about supplies, one thing I put on the supply list that you might want to have is an extra palette there. I believe I put a little plastic palette on the supply list. I'm going to use this ceramic palette that I have. Have that off to the side so I can mix up some different values of this blue. And then have my gouache over here on this side. Trying to get all of those things on screen. as I'm working so you can see what I'm doing. And this gouache set has been very loved recently. I've been using it a lot. So it doesn't look the prettiest. I actually use my new one. We're just going to use one blue, but my new one definitely has more white. Let me do that actually. There's no reason for me to struggle when I have this new one just because the new one wasn't on the supply list. This one has 18 colors and the new one that I bought has 24 colors. I'm really pleased with the price on those at Michael's too. I really enjoy this jelly gouache and I love how reasonably priced it is. And this one, I just so happened to be using a blue monochrome already the other day. And the beautiful thing about, so I'll still use this palette, so I mix them again. But the beautiful thing about gouache is that it can be constituted, it can be re-wetted. So if, sorry, just one moment. I have way too many things, but I don't want to put the sketchbook too far away in case I need to refer to it. I'm gonna grab a chair, put it off to the side here. This is also the first time I'm combining a class like this instead of doing part one and part two. It's quite a lot to switch between drawing to painting on my little workspace here, but we're doing it. Okay, so yeah, you can re-wet it. That's why I saved this and I can just add water to these colors and they're ready to go again. Someone had a question about watercolor. It looked like I saw the word Kuretake pop up. Are Kuretake paints similar to these paints? So Kuretake is a brand, and I'm pretty sure those are watercolors. So gouache is opaque watercolor. So it is different. Just a little bit about gouache. Basically, all paint is just a pigment plus a binder, right? So gum arabic is the binder that is used for watercolor and gouache. So with gouache, there is a little more of the binder than the pigment. So it is more opaque in that way. And it dries and has a matte finish. So watercolor is not going to dry and have a matte finish like gouache. You can see this example, how it kind of has that matte quality to it. And gouache paint has been around for many centuries. People tend to think it's kind of a modern thing, but it's actually the oldest type of paint. It was used in illuminated letters and in original manuscripts, like the Gutenberg Bible, stuff like that. It was used, oh my gosh, I'm trying to remember. I have like a whole little bullet point thing from my in-person gouache class. It's been around for a very long time. So, but it's just opaque watercolor. It's got, I like to say if there is a scale from ink to watercolor, gouache would be right in the middle. And I've actually even done a class on watercolor, ink, and gouache, and you can find that class by searching on YouTube. It might be should be in that playlist, perhaps that the Michaels folks made. It's a strawberry that we painted in watercolor, ink, and gouache, so you can see the differences between the three of them. Okay, so yeah, you can definitely do this class with watercolor if you don't have gouache. It's totally fine. Didn't mean to discourage or anything, just explaining the difference. Okay, so let's get back to it here. We're going to make our value scale of a color. So first, we're going to choose what color we're going to use, and I'm going to use blue again. Oh, and then Pam is asking jelly versus regular gouache. What's the difference? Some gouache comes in a tube, and then the jelly gouache comes like this in these little pans. So and since it's not, it's got a different viscosity to it than watercolor. Often those are called cakes, and I think maybe it's called jelly because of the jammy quality that it has. And honestly, I've not looked that up, so I don't know if that is true. I'm doing a bit of what my precocious 11-year-old does right now, where I'm just using my logical reasoning skills to form a conclusion. And most of the time, she's right, y'all. I will think she's just making stuff up, and then I look it up, and lo and behold, she's right. So look it up and then tell me, am I wrong that that's why it's called jelly gouache? I have not found any difference between this gouache paint and the gouache that comes out of a tube. It's just packaged differently, and I believe that's why it's called jelly gouache. But I could be wrong, so let me know if you know differently. All right, so I'm going to choose a blue and maybe two blues. This set has two different blues in it, and the 18, I have a little card with the colors in both of them. This is the little color card for the 18 color set. And it has this acid blue, and then it has an ultramarine. So those two blues would be really nice if you didn't want to go all the way to black and you wanted your ultramarine to be your darker blue. Or you could add black as well. Hopefully that's not complicating it for anybody. And then white is what I'm going to choose. So let's see. Yeah, and it's oh no, here it's got a sky blue and an acid blue. Actually, I think this is the sky blue. This one that looks a little, I'm going to use this one. So I think that is the acid blue. It's okay if you use a different blue than me. And the only change between any other colors, and I would love to see y'all do this or a similar item in some different colors too. It's just always fun if we don't all do the exact same thing. So the only difference between if you wanted to do any other color like pink or green or purple, you would use black for the darker side like I'm about to demonstrate. But if you were using yellow, I would advise that you use the dark brown as your black, because if you add the slate black to the yellow, it's going to turn it kind of greenish, which I think looks cool, but if you wanted to really keep it a yellow scale. Okay, so first we're just going to take whatever color we're going to use and we're going to paint a little swatch of it. So I'm just putting my paintbrush, loading up my jelly gouache here. I'm going to get a little bit of water on my brush and just move it around over here. Just get it kind of flowing. And if this is your first time ever using gouache, you might want to check out that other class later that goes through just the basics of brush strokes and just getting more acquainted with it. But this will definitely help you get acquainted with it, just diving in as well. Nothing wrong with just going for it. And so I'm just going to paint a little swatch there. So one thing about gouache or probably the trickiest thing about gouache is that the values dry differently. So darker values will dry lighter and lighter values will dry darker. And that can be really confusing for a lot of people. So if you find that super confusing, then the main point is to just wait for each layer to dry. And then you can assess what needs to happen next. Okay, so we just painted our little swatch of our main color. That's going in the middle. That is like our medium gray is the main color. Okay, and then now we're going to paint white at one end. I'm just going to take some of my white over here by itself, make sure my brush is nice and clean. Otherwise, I will be already making a tint of blue. And we're going to paint our white gouache here at the bottom, just a little swatch of white. It maybe won't show up super bold on the paper by itself, but it definitely will when we get it on top of some other blues. And then I'm going to clean my brush again, painting the bottom of the cup. And then here's where you could use a darker blue or black. I'll just go ahead and use black because I don't want to do anything that's going to be too confusing. So just taking some black, and I just like to get it kind of flowing on my brush, especially for those of you who've never used gouache before. It doesn't hurt to just paint a little bit on your palette with it. And it'll also help your brush get nice and loaded up. And then we'll paint a little swatch of the black. Did anyone try to verify why it's called jelly gouache? I'm curious. I see a lot of activity in the chat, but
I found the answer. I posted it in there for everyone.
what is it? Tell me.
Jelly wash and traditional wash differ primarily in their consistency and presentation. Jelly gouache is a softer, more gel-like paint in a pudding cup style container, while traditional gouache comes in tubes.
Okay, I wasn't too far off then. All right, so now let's start to make our tints and shades of our blue or whatever color you're using. So I'm going to get a nice big pile of my blue, got a huge amount of it, and I'm going to take it over here on my palette, and I'm going to maybe separate it to a few different piles of white because we're going to make a few different tints here. And then I'm going to clean my brush, and I'm keeping my water cups separated by light and dark. So when I'm using the darker colors, I'm washing them off in one water cup. And when I'm using lighter colors, I'm using the other water cup, just so that I don't have to change my water cup water too frequently or at all during this class. Okay, so I cleaned my brush, and also the smaller the brush you're using right now where you're mixing colors, the better. Sometimes I forget to say that, and I have been recognizing that that's where a lot of students in my in-person classes get tripped up when they're mixing values and colors, is they might be using their biggest brush or just a bigger brush to mix colors. And so then the paintbrush is like a sponge, so it's soaking up some of those some of the paint is still in there, and you think you got it off the brush and then you didn't, so then it's affecting the other values that you're making. Okay, so
Adrian, Karen's wondering, would it be possible to see a bit more of your palette when you're mixing the colors?
let's see. Oh yeah, let me scoot it over. Yeah, why do I need my whole painting showing? We're not painting yet, we're just doing our values. Thank you. Okay, so I've got my white separated, and then I'm going to take a little bit of blue, and I'm going to slowly introduce it to one of my little piles of white. And I'm going to get some kind of a tint when I do that. And it might be the next one that I want, or it might be more of like, this one I think would go in the middle between white and blue. So I'm gonna go ahead and paint a little swatch of it. And if your value scale gets out of order, that is totally fine. If you make more than one of the same value, also totally fine. We're just trying to get an understanding of how to create light and dark values of one color here. So I'm looking for something that's like a baby's breath of blue, and then something that's closer to that main midtone of blue. So with one, we're going to want more blue, and with the other, we're going to want more white. So see, I kind of just made the same color again. Add more blue to it. There we go. You can make as many different tints as you want to make. You don't have to just make 3 tints. We don't need a full 10 values here, just a scale that goes from dark to light. And you're going to see as these dry, what I mean about how some values change as they dry. Like it'll go on and it'll look pretty dark. Then as it dries, it's going to get lighter. And then the lighter values might look really light and then they dry a little darker. So it's tricky and interesting like that. And that sometimes drives people a little nuts, but I think it's just kind of cool and an interesting quality of gouache. And the main idea, like I said, is just waiting for your layers to dry before you move on. So if you're really confused by it, then you really just want to be patient and let those layers dry so you can then assess what it's going to be when it's dry. Just wait for it to dry and then you'll see. You don't have to try to do value scale, time travel math. All right, so I'm looking for a real pale baby blue here, or maybe you're making pink, or maybe a orange sherbet if you're using orange or red or violet. You want a really pale violet here. All right, so that's pretty good for the tints. And now we're going to make our shades. You always want to start with the lighter color first and then slowly introduce the darker color because the darker color will eat the lighter color. That's why I started with white and then slowly introduce the blue. So now I'm just adding more blue to my pile here. And you can use the lid of the jelly gouache, or if you have that new 24 set, it comes with that fun little palette there. If you don't have a palette. So now I'm going to take the blue over here separately and then add a little black. Clean my brush first so that I don't turn my entire black pile blue. And sometimes the easiest way to get the extra paint off is to just paint on a separate place on the palette. So I'm just getting some of that extra black off that way. Just wiping it off there. And yeah, when you add the black to the blue, you're going to get some kind of a shade of blue now. So we've got shades on the darker side, tints on the lighter side, and then our main color there in the middle is our hue, H-U-E. And I went over all of that and we took a big cut, well, like 3 or 4 pages of notes in that Gouache 101 class that I referred to. Oh, I'm about to turn my blue pile different because that was a little more black than I wanted in that first one. I want something that's just one level up. And you want to be careful not to mix any white with this because then the gray will do something else to your blue. So we're just mixing black on the shade side and we're just using white and blue on the tint side. So blue plus black on this side, blue plus white on this side, just blue in the middle or whatever color you've been using. And I still just keep getting too dark of a blue. This is why I was saying using dark blue instead of black. could be an option if you don't want your black to be too overpowering. All right, there we go. Just looking for something that's still a mid-tone. One shade up. And I've already got another shade up of a darker blue here. They might look kind of similar. Maybe you did accidentally make this, like maybe I made the same value twice, but this one does seem a little darker. Okay, and then we want one that is a really dark blue. It might even look almost black, but we know we've got blue in there. And we're gonna see that when it dries, I'm just turning my whole blue pile dark blue now. But we'll see when it dries that it'll be a little different.
You're getting some major props in the chat, Adrian. Great instructor.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I love it. Okay, so now we made our value scale and we've talked about how we're going to sketch this. So for the sketch on the watercolor paper, I'm just going to keep it super light. I'm using an H pencil and you're not going to be able to see my lines, but that's why we drew it out separately before. And I'm just looking for, oh wow, this H is coming out a little darker than I want it to. There's a 2H. Well, that's okay. I can always take the top layer off. We'll just erase it here before we start painting. But I don't seem to have a 2H handy. And honestly, you don't even necessarily need to sketch something like this again. You could just go for it with the paint. And we're gonna do another little trick here as we get rolling in just a second where we're gonna kind of paint over all of this. But just to get the vague idea of some of those shapes down for myself doesn't hurt. Okay, and I'm just gonna leave it at that. And then I'll take my eraser and just take the top layer of the pencil off so that my pencil lines are just not interfering with this first layer that we're gonna do, because we're gonna treat the watercolor like, or sorry, we're gonna treat the gouache like watercolor in these early stages. So we've created all these different tints and shades over here. We're going to take one of our tints that we made that is on the lighter side and might need to make a big pile of it first. Let me make, so we're going to make a tone. We're going to start with a tone here. So first I'm going to make a nice big pile of one of my tints of blue. And I'm breaking my own rule here and adding the white to the blue instead of starting with white. Because I want a pretty big pile of it. But then we are going to water it down a bit, so it doesn't maybe need to be that big, but that's okay. I'm going to actually move over here. It's a big palette. I've got room. All right. So I made my little pile of my tint, or my big pile of my tint. And now we're going to water it down a little bit. So you can just take your paintbrush in your water cup. Hopefully you've got some clean water or some water that is just a tint, so it's not gonna turn your tint water something darker. I'm gonna actually use a pipette because I have one right here, but you can just drip water from your paintbrush into your palette until you create a little puddle. And if you're using like the flat palette, maybe you have a little dish. They sell these at Michael's. These are handy. You can just, or I have certain little ceramic dishes that I use at home for painting. And I just don't cook with them anymore. But you make a little puddle of your tint color. And I'm gonna get that mixed up. Uh-oh, there's some red gouache at the other end of my palette here. I hope it doesn't mix. I'm gonna end up with a purple. Okay, so we're looking for a real thin puddle here. We're treating it like watercolor for this initial tone that we're gonna do. And we're just gonna paint the whole thing with this tone to get started. And you can always do another layer if it's too thin. But I might just keep mine thin for the sake of time. And this is why I was saying don't get too attached to your drawing because your drawing may disappear as we're doing this. And I'm using a pretty big flat brush to move this paint around, trying to keep my brush strokes going the same direction. I'm just filling in this entire area with that tint of blue. And this is going to help us jump ahead a little bit here because this is going to dry and we're going to be able to add our highlights on top of it, our absolute white spots that we're seeing on this nature item and our dark values. Okay, so once you get that whole area covered, resist the urge to go over it again. You really want to let each layer dry as you go. So you do have to hang out for a minute and wait for this to dry. If you have a hair dryer, you could use a hair dryer. And I just realized did I really? Well, I don't want to use a hair dryer anyway because it's not necessary. If you just wait a minute, this will dry pretty fast if you did it nice and thin. And let me see, do we have any questions in the chat I could address or any comments while we're waiting for this to dry? So what we're going to do is we're going to slowly increase the viscosity or the thickness of the paint as we go. And if you had more time, and if you're maybe watching this later on YouTube, this would be a good time to maybe pause the video and wait for this to dry completely and then do another layer of the tone that's a lot thicker and then wait for that to dry. I'm not going to do that because we don't have enough time for me to do that. But you can see I left this tone very thin. And then I just went thicker and thicker with the paint that I added on top of it. So it's not a big deal, especially for just a little study to keep the background thin. But if you want to check out some other gouache classes I've done, like there was one called King Trumpet Mushrooms, part 1 and 2. We went real thick with that background. We didn't do a tone, but we added a background of like a pink, violet, red violet background. And then we painted the mushrooms in the center, but we did a couple of layers on the background. And also I did a pet portrait class using gouache a couple months ago or a few months ago. And that was part 1 and part 2 of that pet portrait class. And again, we let a background dry completely and then did another layer. But for this one, it's fine, I think, just for this little monochromatic study for the background to be thin. But if you have the time and you want to wait for this to dry completely and then do another layer. Okay, and so how you can tell if it's wet or dry. This maybe seems a little facetious, but sometimes in my in-person classes, especially because I can see what students are doing, I can't necessarily see what y'all are doing until you hold it up at the end. But I know some of you probably are antsy to hurry up and put the next layer on. You really want to practice patience with water media. You want to let each layer dry before you move on to the next layer. One, because as we can see that these have dried, the values dry differently when they're wet versus when they're dry. Like this really seemed like a much lighter value here, but now that I see it drying, these two values are very similar. And this one seemed almost identical to this value, but now that it dried, it seems different. So that's one reason. The other reason is it will start to get muddy. The consistency of it will not uh, be ideal. You're going to be able to control it a lot better if you wait for each layer to dry before you move on. And in that Gouache 101 class where we practice all of the different brushstroke techniques, you can see why the dryness of the first layer affects what you do next, because we do a bunch of wet on wet and dry on wet brushstroke techniques in that class. So we demonstrate it and you can just see the difference. And then, yeah, the thing that I do with my in-person students a lot is walk around and be like, is this dry? Is this paper dry? Like I'm touching it and it's not coming off on my hand, but it's not completely dry yet because for one, it's still shiny right here. It's still pretty wet right there and it's shiny. So that's one way you can tell it's still wet and you need to wait a minute. If it's buckling, like there's a bubble in it, it's still wet. You want to really wait for it to be completely dry and that buckling will go away a little bit. And when I touch it, it's still really cold. So that's the other way that I know it's still wet. And that seems a little facetious, but it's worth noting that that is still wet and we really want to wait for it to completely dry. Okay, I see somebody had a comment. Important to add, you were just tapping the graphite with a kneaded eraser to lighten it. Yeah, exactly. I'm not taking all of the graphite away. I can still see my pencil lines through this. It may not be showing up on the Zoom, but I can still see my pencil lines. Mm, okay, let's see. Some good questions about how to find those other classes. Uh, oh, thank you, Rich, for your warning. You won't be able to see my sketch. I appreciate that. Yeah, the ongoing struggles of graphite on Zoom. Okay. Even though I just did that big preachy thing about waiting for it to dry, I don't want to wait too long because we're already after 7 o'clock here. So I'm going to do a strategic thing and I'm going to start over here on this side where it is at least a little more dry than over here. And this may just be one of those do as I say, not as I do moments, because you really do want to wait for it to be completely dry because you'll have more control. Okay, so let's start to add some other values to this. And I'm always inclined to go straight for the drama and look for the really dramatic aspects of the image that I'm working from or the object that I'm looking at and push those dramatic tens and zeros because that's what's going to create that high contrast. So we already talked about what those were in the creases of those cracks and then inside of some of those little knobby moments and circles. So if you are going all the way to black with your study here, then we'll go ahead and use, actually, even if you are going to go all the way to black, let's use that darkest shade first. Because maybe you want to just stay there. I really feel like sometimes black can be a little overpowering. And in a lot of these classes I've talked in previous gouache classes, I have talked about like the cat portrait, good example for sure. Well, no, we did use slate black on my cat, but maybe I made my own black. If you make your black using brown and blue, you're gonna have a black that has more dimension to it. But we're not gonna get into that here. But my point is going to just the darkest blue may be dark enough, and you maybe don't need the the absolute slate black. So let me just make a bigger pile of my dark blue. And if you want it to be darker than your darkest blue, you can always add another layer to it. Okay, and so if you want to really control how you're painting with the gouache, the ideal way to layer and blend, because that was the title of our class, was layering and blending, is to slowly increase the thickness of the paint. So you're slowly altering the viscosity until you get to a really thick, for your last layers, to a really thick gouache. So for now, I'm just adding water to this. I don't want it to be a puddle. I don't want it to be as thin as that layer that we did, that we treated more like watercolor. And I'm also kind of stalling a little bit because I'm letting this dry a little bit more in case you didn't notice. And look how different this looks, wet versus dry too. That's the number one reason to hang out and give it a minute. Patience is the one thing I cannot teach, but I can model it and hope that y'all are using it as well. Okay, so I'm gonna use a round brush. I was using a different color to mix there, and I added quite a bit of water, so it's pretty fluid, but it's definitely not as thick as it would be like we did on those initial swatches, not adding too much water to it. And I can always go thicker on my next layer. I can always go darker with the black, like I said. So just going in a little bit more with a dark blue and watering it down is just a way to have a little more control and take it slow. Okay, but I am going to go straight for the dramatic moments. Even though it's thin, it's going to look really dramatic when it goes on wet, but then when it dries, it's going to be obvious that it's a little thinner than it may look right now. And I'm just looking at those darkest values. I'm going for those really dark shapes that we talked about in our drawing. I'm not worried about perfection here at all. Just getting the general idea. Okay, and another thing that I talked about in the original Gouache 101 class was pen and ink shading techniques like hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling. The more you can keep the energy or the idea of drawing with your paintbrush and hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling with your brush strokes, the better off you're going to be with gouache. And I've had a number of classes on those shading techniques with pen and ink. And as I mentioned before, we've had several classes on gouache that you can go back and check out in the catalog. We did the king trumpet mushrooms. We did abstract studies and gouache and mixed media. We did the pet portrait. We did another value study in gouache last year, doing a landscape. So if you just search the word gouache and my name on YouTube, you'll find quite a few gouache classes you can check out. But the way that we're going to blend and layer is all about letting each layer dry. So the fact that I'm going in thin and I'm just kind of drawing with my paintbrush, we don't have to worry about these colors getting muddied together because we're being so patient in the way that we're applying it. And we're starting out thin, and then we're going to go thicker so we can always cover up any mistakes by just waiting for the layer to dry and then going thicker with our next layer because it's so opaque that it'll be able to cover up any mistakes that you might have or any unwanted moments that you might have. So it's fun to go straight for the drama here, or you could slowly build up from light and then go darker. Like we did talk about that one big area of like a medium shadow over here. So let's actually make another, our other blue that was more of a, like a this shade of blue, more of the mid-tone, or maybe even our pure blue with just a tiny bit of black watered down. So something like this. And we'll water it down, and it may upset this layer that we already did right here, but that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and put in that big shadow that we talked about where we're seeing those. But if the layer that you just did is already dry, then it shouldn't upset it too much. So the analogy that I've come up with recently, because I teach so many water media classes, and the dilemma of trying to get people to be patient and wait for layers to dry is just something I think about a lot. How can I get people to just wait? And so I came up with this analogy of you're waiting for a bus, and the bus is the layer that you're on, and you're trying not to let things get muddy, right? So if you were trying to make something happen on this layer and you didn't quite do it, and then everything got super wet, you just missed the bus. Okay. If it's super wet, and the way you know it's super wet, the paper's buckling, it's shiny, maybe even the paper is starting to pill a little bit, like little pills are coming off the paper. That is the paper telling you you missed the bus and you need to stop and wait for that layer to completely dry and then fix it on the next layer. Okay, so you gotta wait for the next bus. Just wait for that layer to dry. And that's it. And that's the thing I say until I'm just blue in the face all the time. And then 90% of the issues that students have are because they didn't do that. They kept messing with it and they didn't wait for it to dry. And now they're frustrated and they don't like that answer. What can I do now? Just wait. Like, well, that's not doing, and that's not helpful, right? We want to keep doing, we want the action to fix it, but sometimes not doing anything is what actually fixes it. Like right there, I'm not happy with what's starting to happen there. And I'm like, well, I can keep messing with that and try to fix it right now. Or I could take my own advice, since that's what I'm literally saying. Just wait for it to dry and then I'll fix it on the next layer. And gouache is so opaque that it's very forgiving in that way. And I'm also treating it a lot like watercolor right now. It's really thin. I've really thinned it out. So it'll dry a little faster when you treat it like watercolor, and then you can slowly increase the thickness. But I wanted to go ahead and establish all those mid-tones, that medium shadow that I was seeing everywhere. And it maybe is a little too blocky, but I can go back into it with the highlights and the lowlights and fix that up in just a bit. And with this next layer that we're going to do, we're going to go thick because I am aware we're running out of time. But I want to make sure I hit those key points of the class, layering and blending. If you're taking notes, the key to both layering, well, the key to layering is let it dry. Let each layer dry before you move on to the next layer. And the key to blending is thinking about those value shading techniques that you use with pen and ink, hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling. So I'm not going back and forth with my paintbrush on the same area. I'm just making a brush stroke more like a hatching mark. And then I'm going next to it and doing another little hatching mark, thinking more like I'm drawing with my paintbrush. And so I'm going to blend more like I would with pens than I am. Honestly, I teach oil painting too, and it's the same thing with oil painting. If I could just get people to not do this action so much, I would be such a happy teacher. This action really does not help the painting process. Like when you do that, you're just pushing the paint around in that same area. Like if we're trying to really blend something really fast, then a nice little scrubby motion can be really helpful. I'm not saying it's never a good idea to do that, but with water media, especially if you can think about kind of dropping it in or spreading it around or filling in an area, but you're not necessarily rubbing into it with your paintbrush. That's usually not what you want to do with water media, or honestly, even oil paint. Okay, that got really wet right there. So definitely I need to let that dry for a minute, but I can pass the time by seeing if there were any comments or that I could answer, or maybe mixing up my next value. Thanks, Deb. Deb liked my analogy. Okay. So now we want to go a little thicker with our next layer when this dries. I can go ahead and mix up my paint and get it ready to go on that next layer. Let's go for some highlights now because we've been focusing on the shadows so far. So yeah, this has kind of dried on my palette a little bit right here, but I can just take my paintbrush and keep getting it wet and moving my paintbrush around. This is where on your palette you can get all that back and forth brushing around with your paintbrush energy out. But on your painting, I was even joking in my oil painting class one day, like, when you see, it's usually like really dramatic in a movie, somebody might like make one big brush stroke and then step back and look at like, as if that one brush stroke made all the difference. And that can seem really dramatic, but that's actually what you want to do. You want to make one little mark at a time, even with oil paint. There's no rush, but especially with gouache, because again, it looks so different wet versus dry. So all that activation that you're doing is really just keeping it wet, and you really want to wait for it to dry to assess what comes next. Okay, so if you wanted more control, you can keep it kind of thin and then slowly increase to thick, but I'm going to go ahead and go pretty thick. So I just dipped my paintbrush in my water cup a couple of times just to get it kind of smoothly loaded up on my brush, but I'm uh not really watering it down like I was before. And yeah, see, you can really see how thin I was going before in that last layer. Now it seemed thicker when it was wet, but now that it's drying, it's not totally dry, but it is drying. And you can see how transparent it actually was. You can see how transparent those darker blue, the shades of blue that I used were. They dried lighter. Everything just looks so much different now that it's dry. So I'm gonna start to put some of those lighter values back in, and I'm going pretty thick with this layer. So once you start going thick, you can't go back to thin. So if I were to go thick with it, and I talk about this in the Gouache 101 class where we just are doing different brush strokes, if I were to go super thick and then try to go back to a watery layer with the gouache, it will make it crack when it dries. So you don't want to do that. And ideally you do want to wait for this to dry completely, but this is dry enough. So I'm looking at my photo and noticing some of those highlighted moments, putting some of those back in. And now I can really see how light that tone that I started with was. It was looking way darker when it was wet. So you might even want to do another layer of these darker colors before you start to put, or just, you can always go back in and put them in again too. But it would have been nice to go ahead and put another layer of those darker colors in and then go back on top with the white, especially since the white is always the most opaque. I think it's better to save the lighter tones for last. So actually, before I get too far here, how are we doing on time? Is, oh my goodness, how did that happen so fast? Okay, let me go a little thicker with the dark blue. Rich, are you okay with us going over for a few minutes?
Sure.
Okay, great. Let me just put in at least, it's just so fun to see it come to life even more with the thicker paint. And I saw some of you saying it's so fun to watch it come to life. So I'm going to use just the blue all by itself and nice and thick, and start to put some of those darker values in, and reminding myself it's okay if we don't finish this. My example wasn't even finished. I was planning my May classes, and I've got some really exciting tree studies that I'm just planned for May. They may already be up on the website. I haven't looked yet, but I just turned them in the other day. So I think they are. Uh anyway, there's another gouache class that we are very unlikely to finish. Finish is such a relative term, but I left it very incomplete, underdeveloped, because it's a long process when you're really layering with lots of different colors in a gouache study. And I didn't want to go too far to where there's no way we're going to get that far in the class. And then same thing with the tree studies. I had to remind myself that I didn't want to go too far where it couldn't be replicated very much. So they're both really underdeveloped, but in an implied fun way.
We've got a great question here, Adrian. If a color is dry on the palette and you add water to reactivate it, wouldn't the color become a different hue? How much water do you need to add in order for the color to be the same hue, or do you need to add the gouache color again to achieve the same tone?
It will be the same color, it just won't be the same thickness because it's probably going to become thinner when you add water to it. Like here, I've got these dried blues over here. Let me just add some water to it. See, it's not changing the value or anything too much. It's just gonna maybe be a little thinner. Let me paint a little swatch of it right there. So it's more of a thin value, but it's still the same, still the same value, still the same color. It's not changing the color unless you have a different color on your paintbrush that you're adding to it. But if you're just adding water, it's just going to make a thinner version. So it's not going to be as thick, maybe. It depends on how big your pile is. Like I've got a pretty big pile right here. I can get that to be pretty thick when I add water to it. Okay, let me just switch to my other painting, I think this is just one of those where I gotta do the cooking show thing and pull out my more finished souffle to add these last flourishes. So what I think really creates the most visual impact in a study like this is those tens and zeros. So, and I didn't go all the way to black hair, but I did obviously go thicker. So if I just take this blue black that's nice and thick, and my long skinny brush and start to put in those dark values nice and thick, well, now it's going to dry and be pretty close. You know, the thicker it is, the less change I feel like there is and when it dries, if that makes sense. I mean, it's still going to dry a little bit lighter of a value, but not as much as it would if it was a transparent layer. So since I'm going in nice and thick, like that really just makes it pop. And then likewise, the absolute white areas, when I go in with my absolute whites and I go in super thick, like when we did the pet portrait, it was so fun adding the white whiskers super thick with the gouache. It just has such a graphic quality. That's what I love about the gouache and what I find draws a lot of people to gouache in my in-person classes, you know, because I get more feedback from them. Y'all can tell me in the chat what you like about gouache the most, but people really love the the graphic quality, how it feels like an illustration in a certain type of illustration. There's a great artist who created a lot of the concept art for Disney, like Cinderella. Her name is Mary Blair. She illustrated a number of children's books as well. She painted in gouache. But just when we add these absolute white highlights, the way it just pops out, and it's just when it's all thick and juicy like that, it just really creates a nice visual impact. So that's the last thing I wanted to demonstrate. And yeah, these little moments, these little details, like maybe you use your paintbrush with your long skinny paintbrush, your most liner brush like this, and you look for some little, get it to be at a nice little point there, some small little dots. And this is what I mean about hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling being so helpful, is if we think about drawing with our paintbrush, we can really get these smooth little graphic moments in there to happen. And create a lot of fun areas of interest like that. And if you keep rubbing back and forth with your paintbrush a bunch, it's hard to achieve that same quality. And then if you
Adrian,
make, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just a quick question from Karen. She's been waiting for a bit. Could you explain about how you connect the islands of color using the overtones and undertones that you brought up?
Okay, yeah, that was actually just what I was about to say is like you can correct your mistakes as you go by going back in with that mid-tone color. So, or you could match the color that you have for that background tone, and you could go back in and kind of connect everything with that, and then just keep hatching and cross hatching with your different values into it. Eventually, it's going to connect together just like a pen and ink drawing would. So that's why if you're not familiar with hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and scribbling, you definitely want to practice that a little bit because I'm going to just get really close to the camera. Let me see if it'll focus. Not quite. But there's little hatching lines of white on top of a layer of the mid-tone blue, and that's what blends it. Okay, so I'm just everything I've been doing, you're just doing that repeatedly until you, like right here, I've got this undertone. It's already there, that layer of the mid-tone, right? And then if I go on top of that with my lighter value and I start to hatch in some of these lines, see how that starts to connect the colors together. Okay, so you're layering through your mark making, through these individual brush strokes that you're doing, layering upon layering with that. So it's a process. It takes some time. And I thought we would have gotten farther than we did, but that's how far we got. But hopefully I explained, filled in those gaps for you. And you can check out some of those other classes in gouache and see how I've done the same thing, but just not using the monochromatic color. But definitely the pet portrait class and the king trumpet mushroom class, they go through all these same topics and blending. Pet portrait class, definitely you'll see how I start to bridge and connect different layers of color. And that's a two-part class, so there's a little more time to let things dry and keep going. Okay. Oh, that is beautiful. Jerry Lynn. Oh, well, I want y'all to hold these up so I can see these. We can all see them even on the Zoom recording. So if you want to hold up your artwork, um, I see somebody posted a picture of theirs in the chat, but I want to see it on here. There's Barbara. Oh, Barbara did yellow. Love it. Yeah, and then the browns with the darker values, that is coming along. Yeah, just be patient with it. Seeing a face in there too. Oh, there it is. Jerry Eileen. Gorgeous with the browns. Yes, with those natural earth tones. That is just beautiful. And I love how you're staying super thin with those other layers, but then now when you go in really thick and graphic on those last layers, that's going to look so, I mean, it's already looking realistic, but when you add your last thick moments, it's going to really pop. So exciting. All right, anybody else? Mabel? Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, I love how you're, yes, just doing those brush strokes like pen and ink techniques, and you've even got some gorgeous line weight variation happening there. That's wonderful. Yes. Oh my God, Diana always blows me away. That is what I'm talking about, people. Yes, with those thick graphic lines. She knows what she's doing. Look at those gorgeous nails, too. I love it. Feel free to email me a copy of that when you're done, Diana. I would love to share that with some other gouache students. Oh, that's just so beautiful. Oh my goodness. Y'all blow me away. I just love seeing your artwork at the end of these classes. All right, so we got a 2-week or 1-week break. We'll be back in 2 weeks for some drapery drawing, which is really helpful for if you're struggling to see these light and dark value shapes, because drapery is just pure value shapes. It'd be fun. We're going to do it in graphite and pen and ink in April. So looking forward to that. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Rich. See you next time.